Hey guys, tonight we will delve into the forgotten fairy tale of Nonsuch Palace, a magnificent structure said to have had no equal on Earth. Nonsuch Palace. The very name holds a challenge of sheer arrogance. It was built by King Henry VIII with one singular purpose: to flaunt his absolute wealth and power before the entire European continent. It was a dazzling Renaissance masterpiece, with glittering gold-plated stucco reliefs and mysterious labyrinth gardens. It was even a favourite retreat of Queen Elizabeth I. But what happened when the splendour of the Tudor dynasty faded? Why was a structure of unimaginable historical value and significance like Nonsuch ordered to be destroyed, levelled and erased from the historical map by its very own heirs? This is a mystery of vanity and oblivion, about a home born of ambition but ending in silence. Before we begin this journey to find the lost house, and so that I know you also enjoy these light historical stories, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please let me know where you are relaxing and what the local time is now. This helps me visualize our community traveling through time and history together at this very moment. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Nonsuch, the magnificent Renaissance masterpiece built by King Henry VIII to awe all of Europe, and later cherished by his daughter, Queen Elizabeth I. Yet when the Tudor dynasty ended, this glittering jewel of royal architecture vanished from the face of the earth. What happened to this house of dreams? Why did a palace so extraordinary, so costly, so full of pride and splendour, come to such a quiet and tragic end? Tonight, let us drift slowly into that story. The rise and fall of Nonsuch Palace, the lost home of the Tudors. King Henry VIII was a man who already had everything a monarch could desire. He possessed Windsor Castle, the vast and imposing Whitehall Palace, Greenwich where he had been born, and even the Tower of London, which still served as a royal residence. Yet, in the final decade of his reign, when his body was heavy and his temper heavier still, he decided that it was not enough. He wished to build something so magnificent that the world would gasp, a palace so unique that none such existed anywhere upon the earth. Thus the name was born, Nonsuch. In truth, Henry was not only competing with time, but also with his lifelong rival across the Channel, King Francis I of France. The two monarchs had spent decades in rivalry over everything: their strength, their carves, their charm, their wealth, and even their wrestling skills. Francis had once thrown Henry to the ground in a match, a humiliation the English king never forgot. But above all, the competition extended to art and architecture. The French king had built Fontainebleau and Chambord palaces that dazzled Europe. Henry, proud and restless, vowed to create something finer still. Officially, Nonsuch was described as a modest hunting lodge, a retreat for the aging king, a place of solace and retirement. But that was a fiction. It was in truth a monument to vanity, a stone and plaster proclamation of power. If Fontainebleau was elegance, Nonsuch would be excess. If Chambord was grace, Nonsuch would be glory. Every wall, every carved emblem, every gilded panel would proclaim the might of England and the genius of its sovereign. In April of the year 1538, Henry purchased land in Cuddington, a small village in Surrey, to begin his new project. It lay within a day's ride of London, perfectly placed for royal visits. There, upon the rolling fields and humble cottages, he would raise a dream. The village itself had existed since the 11th century and appeared in the ancient Domesday Book, yet its long life meant little to the king. Soon its church and manor house were torn down, its people displaced, its soil claimed for the crown. As work began, Henry spared no expense. Over 500 workmen were hired. Stone from the recently dissolved Merton Priory, a 13th century monastery destroyed in the Reformation, was carted away to feed the growing walls of his new palace. The cost quickly soared beyond £24,000, a fortune then, equal to nearly £19,300,000 today. Nonsuch was surrounded by two great parks: the Great Park, 911 acres, and the Little Park, 671 acres. More than 1,000 deer roamed there for the king's hunts. Yet Henry barely lived to see his dream complete. He visited the unfinished palace only a handful of times twice in the year 1545, and his sixth queen, Catherine Parr, dined there briefly in 1544. The palace, half-built and gleaming in white stone and gilded plaster, seemed less a home than a vision, a glimpse of what might have been, had time granted him more years. One of the few who described Nonsuch in Henry's lifetime was the scholar and poet John Leland, who, in 1545, wrote of it with awe. He said that the king, in his magnificence, erected a structure so beautiful, so elegant and so splendid, that wherever the admirer of florid architecture turns his eyes, he will say that it easily bears away the prize. He spoke of paintings, gilding, and decorations so rich that you would think it the sky spangled with stars. Then he blessed the king with the words, "Long life to the monarch who spares no expense that the ingenuity of his artists may exhibit such wonders." Aye, but Leland's wish would not come true. Henry VIII died in January of 1547. His grand palace, barely finished, became a silent monument to ambition, a jewel left half uncut. The dream of Nonsuch would soon pass into other hands. The child King Edward VI, then Queen Mary, and later Elizabeth herself. Each would shape its fate differently, one with neglect, another with love. And so begins the long, bittersweet story of Nonsuch, born from pride, gilded in power, and destined for disappearance. In the gentle month of April, in the year 1538, King Henry VIII purchased the quiet village of Cuddington in Surrey, a place whose name had appeared in the Domesday Book since the 11th century. For centuries it had stood in peace, its Norman church watching over fields and cottages, its manor house newly built, its people tending their land in humble rhythm. But none of that mattered now. The king had chosen this ground for his new vision, and whatever had been there before would be erased to make way for it. The story of Nonsuch began not with marble or gold, but with demolition. Every stone of the old church was pulled down, its graveyard disturbed, its bells silenced. The manor house followed, along with the modest cottages and gardens that had belonged to the villagers for generations. The lord of the manor, Richard Coddington, was compensated with lands in Norfolk. Some of the local freeholders were bought out, their modest holdings converted into royal property. As for the poorer villagers, those without title or record history does not tell us where they went. Their names and their homes simply vanished. The king's dream required an empty stage. Fortune, or perhaps convenience, favoured Henry's timing. The English Reformation had just swept through the land, and among its casualties was Merton Priory, a 13th century abbey nearby. Its fine stone, carved and seasoned by time, was now available, plundered and hauled down the road to Cuddington to form the skeleton of the new palace. What had once been a house of prayer would become a house of pride. The work began in haste and grandeur. More than 500 labourers were employed to raise walls, dig foundations, carve plaster and lay slate. The cost soon exceeded £24,000 a sum, so vast it would equal roughly £19,300,000 today. Henry spared nothing. Architects, masons, glaziers and sculptors worked day and night to fulfill the king's vision, a palace that would outshine every other in Europe. The plan for Nonsuch was audacious. 2 great parks would cradle the royal house, the Great Park, stretching 911 acres, and the Little Park, 671 acres wide. Together they would hold more than 1,000 deer, reserved for the king's private hunts. It was not simply a residence. It was an entire landscape reshaped to mirror royal magnificence. Even nature itself would bow to the king's will. And yet, for all this labour and gold, the palace would remain unfinished when Henry died in January of 1547. In nearly a decade of construction, the king visited only a handful of times twice in the year 1545, when he stayed for several days, and once when Queen Catherine Parr dined there in September of 1544. The man who had dreamed of a wonder without equal spent barely a few weeks within its walls. John Leland, the royal antiquary and poet, saw the palace during its rising years and left behind a glimpse of its brilliance. He wrote of Henry's magnificence of a structure so beautiful, so elegant, and so splendid that wherever the admirer of florid architecture turns his eyes, he will say that it easily bears away the prize. He spoke of golden gilding and painted panels, of sculptures and ornaments inspired by ancient Rome. "It is," he said, "like the sky spangled with stars." Those words shimmered like prophecy, not only a hymn of praise, but an omen. For behind the glittering facade lay a quieter truth. That beauty, when built upon destruction, carries the weight of sorrow. Beneath the marble foundations of Nonsuch were the remains of Cuddington, the church, the fields, the lives displaced. The king's masons laid his palace stones upon graves. The dream rose, but it rose upon silence. The scale of Nonsuch was a marvel, but its moral cost was profound. In the pursuit of a vision none such as this, Henry had erased an entire community, dismantled sacred history, and stripped stone from a house of God to feed his appetite for immortality. The palace was born from the union of two forces, artistic genius and royal ruthlessness. It was as though every golden relief, every marble carving whispered the same truth. Greatness and greed often share the same face. When Henry died, Nonsuch was still a construction site, scaffolds leaning, frescoes half-painted, the echo of hammers fading into the cold winter air. The monarch who had dreamed of eternity left behind only fragments of it. The deer still roamed his parks. The walls still gleamed white against the Surrey sky. But the heart of the vision, the king himself, was gone. And so the palace remained, suspended between triumph and incompletion. It was a wonder built to glorify one man's reign, yet destined to outlive him only briefly. The villagers who once prayed in Cuddington's church were forgotten, their resting places buried beneath Italian plaster. The king's masons had turned faith into ornament, and history into foundation. Thus, Nonsuch began as both miracle and warning, a place where beauty demanded sacrifice, and where the grandeur of power carried the shadow of loss. Henry's dream had come to life, yes, but it had come at the price of an entire world beneath it. After the death of Henry VIII, his magnificent but unfinished palace passed to his 9-year-old son, King Edward VI. For a brief time, the young monarch inherited not only the throne, but the weight of his father's ambitions. Yet Edward, frail in health and burdened with governance far beyond his years, had little opportunity to enjoy Nonsuch. When he died in the year 1553, the crown and its houses passed to his half-sister, Queen Mary I. Mary, unlike her father, had no affection for this lavish new palace. To her eyes it was young, costly, and unnecessary, a monument to vanity more than virtue. Records suggest she even considered pulling it down altogether, to save the considerable expense of its upkeep, but she was persuaded otherwise by a man who had once served her father faithfully, Henry Fitzalan, the 12th Earl of Arundel, then Lord Steward of her household. Arundel appealed not only to her purse but to her heart, claiming that, for the love and honour he bore to his old master, King Henry, he wished to purchase the house from her, so that it might be completed according to the king's first intent. In the year 1556, the sale was completed. Arundel gave up rich lands in exchange for the estate, and over the following years he and his son-in-law, Lord Lumley, gradually secured both the Great Park and the Little Park, first from Queen Mary, and later from her sister, Queen Elizabeth, who came to the throne in November of 1558. Together, the Fitzalan and Lumley families transformed Nonsuch from a half-finished royal dream into a shining emblem of English Renaissance splendour. Under their care, the house grew into something remarkable, a fusion of Tudor power and Italian grace. The palace was expanded, repaired, and furnished to perfection. Arundel's ambition went beyond possession. He meant for Nonsuch to stand as proof of his loyalty to the Tudors and as a reflection of his cultivated taste. When Queen Elizabeth visited in the year 1559, the palace was ready to receive her in splendour. She stayed for 5 days, entertained by banquets, masques, and music. The children of St. Paul's performed a play for her, and Arundel, ever the courtier, presented her with a cupboard filled with silver plate, a gift both dazzling and symbolic. Yet beneath the spectacle lay politics and longing. The Earl of Arundel, widowed and aging, still harboured the impossible dream of wedding the Virgin Queen. Every masque, every costly feast, every jewel and melody at Nonsuch was, in a sense, a courtship. Elizabeth, gracious as ever, accepted the devotion but not the man. The love that might have joined them remained a pageant only. Still, she loved the house. In 1567, 1569, And again in 1580, Elizabeth returned to Nonsuch. On her last visit, Lord Talbot wrote to the Earl of Shrewsbury that "Her Grace liketh well of this place." Those simple words, quiet, almost casual, captured what Nonsuch had become. A place where beauty soothed the burdens of rule, and where the Queen could walk, if only for a moment, in the long shadow of her father's dream. By 1591, however, fortune had turned once again. Elizabeth desired to bring Nonsuch back under royal control, and she proposed an exchange of properties. Lord Lumley, now the master of the estate, surrendered it to her in return for lands valued at £534 per year. It was perhaps not a fair trade, but the Queen's wishes were law. Lumley retained a lease on the great park and continued as its keeper, ensuring that at least part of his family's legacy remained within reach. The earliest surviving image of Nonsuch dates from the year 1568. It was drawn by Joris Hofnagel and later engraved by Franz Hogenberg for the great atlas Civitates Orbis Terrarum, published in 1598. In the engraving, the palace rises in delicate symmetry, octagonal towers at each end, a central clock tower crowned with an onion, shaped dome like that of the White Tower in London, and a high wall enclosing its gardens. Around it stand out buildings and courtyards, while beyond stretch the rolling parks that once held the royal deer. Most striking of all is the facade itself, covered with elaborate stucco reliefs depicting scenes from mythology, religion, and history. These decorations were the work of Nicholas Bellin, the Italian master plasterer, or stuccator, whom Henry VIII had enticed away from King Francis I's palace at Fontainebleau. When the French king demanded his artist's return, Henry refused. Bellin remained in England and, under Arundel's guidance, adorned Nonsuch with a gallery of marvels that blended classical narrative with royal symbolism. Under Arundel and Lumley, the palace became more than a home. It was a living gallery, a theatre of power, culture, and diplomacy. Within its halls, Elizabeth's court found a stage on which to display the grace and glory of Tudor England. Within its gardens, the Renaissance itself seemed to bloom on English soil. From a hunting lodge begun by an ailing king, Nonsuch had become a golden palace, a mirror of an age that believed beauty itself could be a form of rule. For a time it stood as England's proudest boast, the house that had none such like it in all the world. The most vivid accounts of Nonsuch Palace emerged in the decade of the 1580s, when the house had already reached the height of its beauty under the care of the Fitzalan and Lumley families. Among those who wrote of it, none was more detailed or more poetically inclined than Anthony Watson, a local rector who composed his florid but carefully observed description sometime between the years 1582 and 1590. Watson's words drew a picture so rich that it almost breathes. He began with the Great Gatehouse, a 4-storied structure crowned with 4 towers, its pinnacles resting on sculpted beasts that held decorated shields, lions, griffins and hounds carved in lively motion. Within this entrance lay the kitchen court and the royal stables. Beyond them stood a second gatehouse, topped by a clock tower whose bell rang every half hour, marking the passage of time through the palace's still corridors. The design of Nonsuch followed the Renaissance love of symmetry. 2 great courtyards, an outer court and an inner court, defined its structure. The inner court was the heart of the house, graced by a marble fountain and a statue of King Henry enthroned, 1 foot resting triumphantly upon a lion. The palace itself was divided between 2 sides, the king's side and the queen's side, each arranged in mirror harmony. Watson described the royal apartments with reverence. The king's side began with the guard chamber, leading into the presence chamber and then the privy chamber. The windows were large and generous, filling the rooms with light. From the walls, fountains shaped like silver serpents poured fresh water into basins, a marvel of ingenuity for its time. The king's bedchamber opened onto a gallery overlooking a small garden with a marble fountain supported by 16 ivory columns, where the sound of water softened even the sternest thoughts of state. The Queen's apartments matched the King's in size and beauty. Her rooms enjoyed full use of the gallery and extended as far as the Gate of Penthesilea, named after the Amazon Queen of legend. The ceilings were painted with intricate designs, the floors paved in coloured stone, and every chamber perfumed with sweet herbs. Guests found no shortage of hospitality. The palace held numerous lodgings for visiting nobles, each furnished with tapestries and fine glass. Its library, Watson noted, was remarkable, filled with celestial spheres, globes, bronze and paper instruments, and countless volumes on every art and science. Much of this collection came from the refined tastes of Henry Fitzalan and his learned son-in-law, John Lord Lumley. Together they had gathered one of the richest private libraries in England. Outside, the gardens formed a paradise enclosed by high brick walls. Their fragrance drifted through the palace windows, the scent of cherries and plums, of mulberries and thyme, of pears, apples, rosemary, hyssop, and figs. Ancient oaks, elms, walnuts, and ash trees, survivors from the old village of Cuddington, shaded the walks. Among the greenery stood marble statues and fountains, each a piece of living art. One, perhaps representing Venus, sent slender jets of water from her marble breast into a pool of ivory colour, before the stream fell through pipes into basins below. There were 12 covered porches scattered throughout the gardens, offering shelter from England's rains or shade from its brief summer Sunday. Beyond them lay a labyrinth, where visitors could lose themselves among hedges and laughter, and a wilderness, a natural grove designed for both walking and hunting. Pheasants and partridges brought from across the channel flitted through the trees, while deer and rabbits ran freely in the park. In one secluded corner lay the Grove of Diana, perhaps the most famous of all the gardens. Here, archways of clipped topiary framed sandy walks, and at the centre stood a statue of the goddess Diana, caught in a moment of transforming Actaeon into a stag, a vivid, almost theatrical tableau of myth rendered in stone and water. William Camden, in his Britannia of 1586, praised Nonsuch with classical restraint. He called it a royal retreat built by the most serene King Henry VIII in a most healthful location called Cuddington, with such magnificence and elegance that you would think all architectural skill was compressed into this work. He described its parks full of game, its gardens and groves, its shaded walks a seat where beauty and health were perfectly joined. Later editions of Camden's work added little but confirmed one crucial change. By the year 1607, Nonsuch had returned to crown ownership. He also quoted John Leland's verse, written decades before, in which the poet had said that throughout the realm no equal could be shown, and therefore they called it Nonsuch. Foreign travellers echoed these sentiments in their diaries between the years 1561 and 1637. To them, Nonsuch appeared not merely as a royal residence, but as a sanctuary, a retreat of pleasure and health, where art and nature met in perfect harmony. The palace was at once a home, a museum, and a dream, standing calm amid its parks like a jewel set into England's green crown. By the year 1598, Nonsuch had already entered the world's imagination. Immortalized in one of the grandest publishing projects of the Renaissance civitates, Orbis Terrarum, the great atlas of cities compiled by Georg Born and Franz Hogenberg. Alongside its detailed engraving of the palace, the text described a curious and delightful feature at its entrance, an ingenious echo. Hidden cavities and holes within the stone vaults of the gateway returned the sound of voices, or the blare of trumpets. Not once, but 4 or 5 times. Visitors, stepping through its arches, would have heard their own words ripple through the air as if the building itself were answering. In the great outer court, the compilers noted a vast marble fountain that poured forth abundant water for the use of the house. Around it, statues crowded in lavish ornamentation, mythic heroes, gods, and nymphs gleaming against the pale stone walls. It was a living theatre of sculpture and sound, where water, marble, and music seemed to speak together in praise of royal artifice. That same year, another visitor added his own impressions. The German traveller Paul Henze, who toured England in the late reign of Elizabeth I. His account of Nonsuch, written in 1598, borrowed much from William Camden's Britannia, yet his eye for detail captured scenes that Camden had only hinted at. Henze wrote of marble columns and slender towers, of twin fountains that intertwined their sprays like pyramids, and of small birds perched upon their summits, spouting water from their tiny beaks. He admired the famous Grove of Diana, with its statue of the goddess splashing Actaeon as he transformed into a stag, an Italianate marriage of myth and water. Henze even mentioned a playful marvel, a marble pyramid laced with hidden pipes that would suddenly spray unsuspecting guests, one of those mischievous tricks beloved in Renaissance gardens. To stroll through Nonsuch, he said, was to wander through a paradise of invention, where art and nature conspired to delight and surprise. Queen Elizabeth herself never ceased to favour the palace. In the year 1599, one observer recorded simply that Her Majesty is returned again to Nonsuch, which of all other places likes best. The following year, 1500 and 1600, she was still riding and hunting within its parks. But even amid such peace, drama found its way into the royal retreat. It was here that the most reckless of her favourites, Robert Devereux, the young Earl of Essex, committed his fatal indiscretion. Returning from Ireland without permission, he burst unannounced into the Queen's chamber one morning while she was not yet dressed nor painted for court. The shock and offence were immense. Within 2 years, after leading a doomed rebellion against her in the year 1601, Essex was executed. The quiet lawns of Nonsuch had witnessed the beginning of his fall. When Elizabeth died in March of 1603, her throne passed to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. The new king granted Nonsuch to his queen, Anne of Denmark. She enjoyed the house, though she found the lingering presence of Lord Lumley, who still held a lease on the great park, as its keeper somewhat vexing. It seems likely that he was quietly bought out. Under Charles I, who ascended the throne in 1625, Nonsuch was once again bestowed upon a queen, this time Henrietta Maria of France. For nearly 24 years it remained in her possession. But when civil war swept through England and the king was executed in 1649, the palace was seized by the parliamentarians. From the early years of James's reign, we have another precious image, the engraving of Nonsuch that appeared in John Speed's map of Surrey, published in 1611. It shows the south front of the palace, with its octagonal towers, the central clock tower rising proudly, and the walls richly adorned with stucco reliefs. In front lay the formal gardens, divided into neat geometric patterns. The view, serene and exact, gives us one of the clearest glimpses of how Nonsuch stood in its glory. The most technical and detailed description, however, came a generation later, in the Parliamentary Survey of 1650, conducted after the estate had been confiscated from the royal family. The surveyors measured everything with precision. The outer court, they wrote, was 150 feet long and 132 feet wide. Its lower story held the buttery, the wine cellar, and 15 rooms for servants. Above, on the upper floor, were the dining room and the drawing room, as well as chambers for the king, the queen, and their distinguished guests. The main gatehouse, 3 stories high, was described as smooth and fair, its top crowned with a spacious chamber commanding a wide view of the surrounding countryside. Beyond it lay the inner court, 137 feet in length and 116 feet in breadth. A flight of 8 stone steps led upward to another gatehouse, this one of 3 stories with a turret at each corner. Here stood the great clock and bell, encased within a leaded tower capped by a pointed dome. The lower story of the inner court was built of stone, the upper story of timber, richly adorned and garnished with statues, pictures, and other antique forms of excellent art and workmanship. The surveyors found it, as Watson had once described nearly 70 years before. The white marble fountain still stood in the courtyard, supported by 2 brass dragons, the water supplied by a conduit leading from the little park to a cistern within the western turret. The system was remarkably advanced proof that beneath the beauty of Nonsuch lay ingenious design. Thus, by the middle of the 17th century, even as England's monarchy trembled, the palace of Henry VIII still stood intact, a silent witness of 4 reigns, echoing not only the voices once heard in its stone vaults, but the long, uneasy song of power, pride, and time. Beyond the glittering facade of Nonsuch, the Parliamentary Survey of 1650 unveiled something even more astonishing, a living ecosystem, a miniature city built to sustain the palace's grandeur. Around the main court stretched a vast network of workshops, kitchens, storehouses, gardens, and lodgings. Together they formed the invisible machinery that kept Henry VIII's vision alive, even a century after his death. To the east of the outer court lay the kitchen court, the beating heart of daily life. Here stood the great livery kitchen, immense and smoky, where meals for dozens of courtiers and servants were prepared. Beside it, the pastry room turned flour and butter into endless tarts and pies, while the boiling house simmered meats and broths for the royal table. Nearby, the bottle house held casks of wine and ale, the coal store, mountains of fuel for the stoves, and around them 7 chambers for the officers of the kitchen, each filled with the clatter of knives and the hum of voices. The air would have been thick with the mingled smells of roast meat, fresh herbs, and wood smoke, a world of labour hidden behind marble walls. Close by was the woodyard, its stacked logs feeding the palace's endless appetite for warmth. There stood a modest house for the gardener, a rush house where reeds were stored for flooring and roofing, and another small buttery and bottle house. Every building had a purpose, every hand a task. Just 8 yards in front of the main house spread the bowling green, trimmed and level, with 2 lines of trees running parallel on either side. This elegant promenade led toward the park gate, creating an avenue that balanced English restraint with the symmetry of Italian design, a ceremonial axis of both leisure and power. Adjoining 3 sides of the inner court lay the privy garden, once perfectly kept but by 1650 already somewhat decayed. A high brick wall, 14 feet in height, enclosed the space in quiet seclusion. Within its walls stood marble pyramids, their white stone catching the weak English sun, and a large marble wash basin, over which perched a pelican carved in lifelike pose. Lead pipes fed water into the basin, a small marvel of Tudor hydraulics. Between 2 other marble pyramids rose a white fountain surrounded by 6 lilac trees, the flowers perfuming the air each spring. This garden, though modest in size, was richly alive. It held 140 fruit trees, apple, pear, plum and cherry, along with 2 yews and a single juniper. Each tree was planted with purpose, blending utility with beauty. In summer, the household feasted on its fruits. In winter, its symmetry delighted the eye. The scent of rosemary and thyme drifted from its borders, mixing with the sound of trickling water and the rustle of leaves. East of the outer court lay the kitchen garden, also enclosed by a 14-foot wall. Here grew the herbs and vegetables that flavoured every meal: leeks, parsley, onions, lettuces, and the sturdy English cabbages that filled the cook's pots. Beyond this lay the orchard, and, farther still, the wilderness, where 72 fruit trees grew in careful disorder. Altogether, these gardens covered about 10 acres, a self-sufficient world that embodied the Tudor Stuart dream of the farm within the palace. The king's estate was not merely a home, it was a carefully managed organism, where art, agriculture, and sustenance intertwined. To the south stood the banqueting house, a 3-story wooden building of quadrangular form, its 4 corners shaped into semicircular bastions like a fortress of pleasure. Within were 3 cellars below, a great wainscoted hall on the first floor, 3 chambers on the second, and 5 on the third. Each room was panelled and well lit, the wood gleaming in candlelight. Here the court once dined apart from ceremony, a place of laughter, music, and secret feasts. Adjoining the banqueting house stood a smaller outbuilding that contained a bakehouse and a room with a well and water wheel, used to draw fresh water from deep below the ground. A small wash-house stood nearby, where linens were scrubbed and hung to dry in the mild English air. The under-housekeeper, a fortunate servant of the royal household, occupied his own dwelling close to the main palace on its eastern side. His wooden, tile-roofed home contained a hall, kitchen, milk buttery, parlour, cellar, and 6 rooms above, along with a private garden and orchard. The proximity was an honour, the comforts considerable. Beside it stood the sorcery house, and another timbered, tiled building of 4 rooms, used by the yeomen of the sauces men responsible for the subtle, spiced accompaniments to royal dishes. Their small domain reflected the precision of Tudor dining, where even condiments were an art form. The estate's infrastructure was fully self-contained. The well house, built of brick, held a water wheel and 2 massive buckets to draw from the aquifer beneath. The stables stood at a distance from the palace, both to reduce noise and to spare the air from the smell of horses. Near them were lodgings for grooms, a bakehouse that doubled as their quarters, and behind it, a small private garden. 2 great barns stored grain, and farther off, the keeper's lodge marked the domain of the ranger who oversaw the parks. Altogether, Nonsuch was more than a royal residence. It was a functioning microcosm, a meticulously ordered world of hierarchy and labour. Every bell that chimed, Every fountain that flowed, every banquet that graced its halls depended on this quiet city behind the walls. It was the unseen miracle beneath the glittering myth, a machine of human hands that kept the dream alive until history itself began to dismantle it. When the parliamentary surveyors completed their work in the year 1650, they took pains to calculate not only the beauty of Nonsuch, but its material worth. Their final assessment was precise and cold. The buildings, together with their marble ornaments and fountains, were valued at £7,020, above the cost it would require to take them down. Though they made no recommendation for demolition, their report read like the measured breath before an ending. Numbers had replaced wonder. The palace was now an entry in an accountant's ledger. Not long after, political reality rendered sentiment meaningless. Stripped of its furniture and finery, the estate was valued again, this time at £14,158.12. It was sold to John Lambert of Wimbledon, a major general of the parliamentary army. Thus, the house once built for a king's pride became the property of a soldier of the Republic. A decade later, history turned upon itself. In the year 1660, the monarchy was restored. Charles II, son of the executed Charles I and Henrietta Maria of France, reclaimed Nonsuch among the royal possessions. The new king, with a gesture both filial and formal, returned it to his mother. For a brief moment, the palace belonged again to the crown, a fleeting restoration of dignity before the slow unravelling resumed. Then came the Great Plague of London in 1665. As the city sickened and emptied, the countryside offered refuge, and Nonsuch, distant yet near enough to London, found a new, unexpected purpose. On the 26th of July, 1665, it was requisitioned for use by the Office of the Exchequer, the Treasury of England. A palace once built for pleasure and ceremony was converted into an administrative refuge during one of the kingdom's darkest hours. Among those who left a record of this strange transformation was Samuel Pepys, Secretary to the Navy, whose diary has since become one of the most vivid windows into the age. On the 21st of September 1665, Pepys wrote of his visit, "Walked up and down the house and park, and a fine place it hath heretofore been, and a fine prospect about the house. A great walk of an elm and a walnut set one after another in order. Hell," he noted the exterior, still magnificent, filled with figures of stories, and good painting of Rubens or Holbein's doing. Historians now doubt this attribution. The decoration was almost certainly older and continental, but Pepys's remark captures the overwhelming visual impression, a facade so crowded with imagery that it seemed a canvas of carved narrative. He also observed a curious feature: the posts and timbers of the outer walls covered with lead and gilded, as though the very bones of the building wore armour. Then, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned wandering into the ruined garden. His words, falling like autumn, leaves a glimpse of decay after the storms of civil war. Just months later, another diarist recorded his own visit. On the 3rd of January 1666, John Evelyn, gentleman scholar and lover of art, went to Nonsuch to dine with a friend stationed there during the Exchequer's temporary relocation. His journal entry, detailed and melancholy, reads like an artist's final sketch of a fading masterpiece. "I supped in Nonsuch House, whither the office of the Exchequer was transferred during the plague, at my good friend's Mr. Packer's, and took an exact view of the plaster statues and bas-relievos inserted betwixt the timbers and puncheons of the outside walls of the court, which must needs have been the work of some celebrated Italian." Evelyn marvelled that the stucco figures, exposed for more than a century to English wind and rain, still retained their form and grace. He urged that they be removed and preserved indoors, writing that a gallery would become them. He described some of the reliefs as mezzo, relievos, life-size depictions of heathen gods, symbols and emblems, the full vocabulary of Renaissance allegory rendered in pale plaster and gold. He noted, too, that the palace consisted of 2 courts, one of stone, the other of timber. The stone court, he said, had been the work of Lord Lumley, from whom it was purchased, while the timber court, in Gothic style, was incomparably beautified. The exterior timbers were sheathed in blue slate, each scale carefully fitted and painted so that the surface seemed carved and enamelled a coat of armour against rot and time. Evelyn's reflections turn elegiac as he records the damage done by the Civil War. The long avenue of elms and walnuts that Pepys had admired was now broken. The rest of these goodly trees, he lamented, both of this and of Worcester Park adjoining, were felled by those destructive and avaricious rebels in the late war, which defaced one of the stateliest seats His Majesty had. By the year 1667, the slow dismemberment had begun. The banqueting hall, once the scene of feasts and laughter, was demolished. Its timber and stone were carted away to Hampton Court Palace, where they were reused, a practical act of salvage that spoke of the age's thrift, but also of its forgetfulness. The bones of Nonsuch lived on, scattered across new walls, as though the palace had been quietly reincarnated into other buildings. These records, Pepys's bright, hurried impressions, and Evelyn's meticulous sadness, capture the last glimmers of the palace before it slipped from history's stage. Once a Renaissance jewel designed to dazzle Europe, Nonsuch had become a bureaucratic shelter, then a quarry. Its echoing halls, once filled with music and masquerade, now heard only the scratch of clerks' wheels and the rattle of wagons hauling away its stones. Thus, by the close of the 1760s, Nonsuch existed in two forms. In memory, as a dream of Italian art amid English fields, and in matter, as fragments repurposed for other men's ambitions. It was the perfect emblem of its age, beauty yielding to utility, art dissolving into economy, a palace reborn as paperwork and rubble. At the dawn of the 17th century, long before its final ruin, Nonsuch still stood proud upon the Surrey landscape. One of the clearest surviving visions of it comes from a painting now held in the Fitzwilliam Museum, an image that captures the palace from the vantage point of its surrounding park. In the distance lies the bowling green, a flat sweep of grass beyond which horsemen chase deer across the open ground. Closer to the viewer, the scene unfolds like a map. The red brick walls encircle the gardens to the right and left, their symmetry framing the main block. A long, tree-lined avenue extends toward the left edge of the picture, leading the eye toward a small wooden structure resting at its margin. This depiction, likely painted in the early decades of the 17th century, lacks the surface brilliance of the Italianate stucco that earlier engravings had celebrated. Gone are the intricate reliefs and shining plaster figures that once turned the walls into a sculpted poem. Yet what it loses in decoration, it gains in spatial truth. The Fitzwilliam painting allows us to read the geometry of Nonsuch, the balance between architecture, enclosure, and landscape, a composition where royal order still ruled the natural world. A later image, created by the Dutch artist Heinrich Dankerts during the 1660s or early 1670s, shows the palace from a different angle. In his canvas, Nonsuch is quieter, more solid, the light falling softly on octagonal towers, red brick chimneys, and the grid of gardens enclosed by tall walls. Trees within the enclosure stand in neat rows, while the outer walks are lined with avenues of equal precision. Around the central mass of the palace cluster smaller buildings, kitchens, stables, and lodgings, their tiled roofs, leaning close to the great house like attendants around a queen. What Dankerts gives us is a vision of endurance, yet one already dimmed. The essence of a palace remains, its towers and proportions still noble, but the Italian skin that once gleamed with Renaissance ornament is either faded or deliberately omitted. The plaster gods, the mythic panels, the gilded scrolls that once made Nonsuch seem a northern echo of Rome, are now ghosts, invisible beneath the English sky. In 1669, following the death of Henrietta Maria, Nonsuch reverted once again to King Charles II. By then the palace was nearly a century and a half old, its beauty weathered but intact. Yet Charles, though charming and intelligent, was no preservationist. He was a king of appetite and restlessness, famous for his many mistresses and his easy disregard for money. Among them, none shone more brightly or more dangerously than Barbara Villiers, the woman history would know as the Duchess of Cleveland. In the year 1670, Charles created her both Duchess of Cleveland and Baroness Nonsuch, and, in the same gesture, granted her the palace itself. The gift was dazzling in title, but poisoned in purpose. For Barbara, Nonsuch was less a symbol of royal favour than a means to settle her mounting debts. The cost of her splendour exceeded even the king's generosity, and the palace, with all its marble and timber, offered the one resource she could convert into cash. During the 1680s, the Duchess leased the estate to the Earl of Berkeley, and soon after allowed it to be dismantled piece by piece. Brick by brick, beam by beam, Nonsuch was undone. There was no single act of destruction, no fire, no collapse, only the slow, deliberate work of men with hammers and carts. Every fragment was saleable. The carved stones, the oak rafters, the gilded reliefs. By the final years of the 17th century, the great palace that had once humbled Europe was gone. This dissolution was not vandalism in passion, but arithmetic. Timber fetched a price, so did stone, slate, iron, and marble. In an age of expanding towns and rebuilding fortunes after war, a palace could be more profitable as parts than as pride. The dismantling of Nonsuch was, in its way, a market transaction, a royal dream converted into currency. By 1900, traces of scattered bodies still lingered across Surrey. The historian Gordon Home recorded that Pitt Place, near Epsom Parish Church, contained carved marble and stonework believed to have come from Nonsuch. The rectory of Street, Martin's, the house called Silver Birches, and Rosebank in South Street, all preserved fragments of finely moulded timber from the old palace. Even barns in Ewell were remembered as having once contained carved beams in their roofs, until they too were pulled down. The palace, it seemed, had not vanished entirely but divided itself among the living, its bones dwelling in the walls and attics of ordinary homes, its beauty reborn in fragments. As for the interior, almost nothing survived in image or record. The gilded ceilings, the painted chambers, the floors of black and white marble, all were lost to time. Only a few reliefs remain to whisper what once was. They lie now in Lumley Chapel at Cheam, at the base of the tomb of Lady Jane Lumley, daughter of Henry Fitzalan and wife of John, Lord Lumley, who died in 1578. There, among the shadows of carved angels and Latin epitaphs, two small stucco panels preserve the language of Nonsuch's vanished art, the last true breath of its decorative soul. From this point onward, the story of Nonsuch drifts from courtly aesthetics to archaeology and remembrance. The palace ceased to be an object of admiration and became instead a subject of recovery. As its surfaces peeled away and its ornaments scattered, the fascination of beauty gave way to the quiet pursuit of knowledge. What had once dazzled the eyes now challenged the historian's patience. Beneath every loss, a new curiosity stirred, not the glory of kings, but the endurance of what they left behind. Between the years 1959 and 1960, nearly 4 centuries after Henry VIII's masons laid their last stones, the earth of Surrey yielded up its secret. Archaeologists began a series of excavations that would, for the first time, trace the true footprint of Nonsuch Palace, the fabled house without equal. What they found was not a ruin, but a memory made solid, fragments of colour, texture, and labour scattered through the soil, each whispering of a vanished magnificence. From the rubble came thousands of pieces. There were stucco ram heads, sculpted by the Italian craftsmen whom Henry had paid handsomely to adorn his walls, ghostly remnants of mythic reliefs once gleaming in white and gold. There were French slates, fine and thin, brought across the channel to roof the royal house, Tudor roses cast in lead, tokens of dynasty once set into the cornices and parapets, and pewter plates engraved with the Lumley badge, relics of the noble family who had later owned and cherished the estate. Among them, archaeologists discovered fragments of expensive window glass, tinted and clear, and pieces of marble polished smooth by forgotten hands. Each shard carried the weight of centuries, humble and radiant, like jewels found in ashes. By combining these finds with earlier records, the Parliamentary Survey of 1650, the 16th and 17th century engravings and drawings, and the written accounts of visitors such as Watson, Camden and Henry, researchers of the 20th century, reconstructed a hypothetical plan of the palace. The result was both illuminating and fragile, a map of absence more than presence. The scholar who drew the plan carefully noted that many areas were conjectural and that the proportions could not be confirmed with absolute certainty. Still, for the first time since the 17th century, the shape of Nonsuch emerged again, faint but real, like a ghost rediscovered through its own shadow. The most astonishing discovery, however, lay beneath the palace itself. Excavation revealed that the inner court of Nonsuch had been built directly upon the surviving foundations and the graveyard of a Norman church, once constructed of flint and rough stone. Beneath that, traces of an even earlier timber church were found, layered deep in the soil. Around the site, more than 100 burials were uncovered, their bones arranged in the quiet order of medieval faith. This revelation was startling in its clarity. It proved, with cold precision, the ruthlessness of Henry's ambition. To raise his unmatched masterpiece, he had erased not only a village but also its sacred heart, demolishing a church that had stood for centuries and building his pleasure palace upon the resting place of its dead. Beneath the marble floors of Nonsuch lay the bones of Cuddington's ancestors. The king's triumph was founded, quite literally, on the silence of the parish he destroyed. From a historian's eye, this layering of structures, church upon church, palace upon grave, reads like a moral map of Tudor power. Beauty in this vision was purchased at the price of displacement. The perfection of art arose from the obliteration of memory. Nonsuch became not only a monument to Renaissance design, but also a mirror reflecting the contradictions of its maker. A sovereign who could commission divine art yet show no mercy to the living souls beneath his feet. On a different scale, the excavated fragments also told a story of international collaboration, centuries before the term existed. The materials of Nonsuch were cosmopolitan: Italian stucco and artistry, French slate and marble, Dutch glazing, English timber and labour. The artisans who shaped its walls spoke many tongues, united in a common pursuit of beauty. In their hands, English architecture, once medieval, defensive, inward-looking, began to wear the robes of Rome. The palace's facades, Romanized upon a timber frame, represented an early act of aesthetic globalization on the island kingdom. Even in decay, the evidence confirmed the written testimony of earlier centuries. The archaeologists could trace the placement of fountains, the location of the gates, and the layout of the courts and gardens described by Watson and the parliamentary surveyors. Pathways, once swept for royal footsteps, reappeared in the soil as faint lines of stone and compacted gravel. The garden's formal geometry, the symmetry that had once delighted Elizabeth I, was faintly visible again, like the memory of music lingering after silence. Yet for all its revelations, the excavation also reminded scholars of what was irrevocably lost. The materials had been dismantled, sold, and scattered across villages. Their fragments could only ever suggest the whole. The archaeologists could not resurrect the palace, only piece together its reflection, a stained glass window reassembled from shards, each fragment luminous but incomplete. Still, those shards were enough. Through them, Nonsuch lived again not as a standing palace, but as an idea reborn in scholarship, in museum cases, and in the imagination of those who loved the Tudor past. The excavations of 1959 and 1960 did more than uncover ruins. They uncovered a paradox. Beneath the story of grandeur and art lay another narrative, one of erasure, endurance, and rediscovery. The ground that had once carried kings and courtiers now held archaeologists kneeling in the dirt, brushing dust from bones and plaster. The circle of time had closed. The palace that had begun as an act of power ended as a lesson in humility, proof that beauty, no matter how triumphant, must one day return to the earth from which it rose. After scarcely a century and a half of existence, Nonsuch Palace, that dazzling symbol of Henry VIII's ambition and theatrical pride, was gone. Its life was a brief flare across English history, consumed by the very forces that had created it. Within 150 years it had passed through every phase imaginable. Conceived as an emblem of royal supremacy, altered and expanded under courtiers, seized and sold by revolution, restored and repurposed by a returning king, and finally dismantled for profit. By the closing years of the 17th century, the great palace had vanished. What remained was a landscape and a memory. The vast parks that had once held more than 1,000 deer were divided into farms. Its bricks and timbers lived on in the houses of Epsom and Ewell. Quiet witnesses to a past grandeur dissolved into domestic walls. A few stucco fragments survived in Lumley Chapel, under the tomb of Jane Lumley, where pale Italian angels still cling to their plaster heavens. The rest, thousands of fragments, catalogued and numbered, lay in storage, the remains of a dream packed away in museum drawers. The words of those who had once praised it, John Leland's glowing verse, William Camden's admiration, Paul Hentzer's florid wonder now echo faintly through surviving images. John Speed's neat engraving on his map of Surrey, Hofnagel, and Hogenberg's grand etching in Civitates Orbis Terrarum, a handful of later oil paintings, and the melancholy diary entries of Samuel Pepys and John Evelyn. Together they form the ghostly archive of Nonsuch, a palace reconstructed not from walls, but from words. Yet the meaning of Nonsuch lies deeper than its art. It was, in its essence, a political and economic mirror of Tudor and Stuart England, a story written in brick, plaster, and coin. Its creation revealed how architecture could become an instrument of diplomacy, a monument to power visible across nations. Henry VIII built it to rival the splendours of Francis I's Fontainebleau and Chambord, transforming rivalry into masonry. Under the Tudors, the palace became a stage upon which England proclaimed its arrival as a Renaissance power. But under the Stuarts, that same architecture became a casualty of fiscal necessity. Civil war, confiscation, and restoration turned the palace into an asset to be valued, leased, mortgaged, and stripped. In a single century, Nonsuch had moved from being a symbol of royal permanence to a commodity of political survival. Its dismantling in the 1680s was not a crime of passion, but a calculation, the conversion of ornament into currency. Marble and timber, slate and lead. Every surface could be priced, every beauty reduced to its weight in pounds. Beneath this economic narrative lies a moral one. The palace's perfection, so loudly celebrated in its day, had been built upon erasure. To make way for it, Henry's men had levelled an entire village, destroyed a Norman church, and buried the resting places of generations under the foundations of the new court. Beauty in this story was born not from harmony but from conquest. The brilliance of its Italian stucco, that sky spangled with stars, as Leland called it, was a thin covering over silence. The moral geography of Tudor power is written in its very ground, the palace that rose from graves. For lovers of Tudor history, Nonsuch remains a house that is gone but never silent. Each figure in its long account, the 500 workmen who raised it, the 1,000 deer who roamed its parks, the 14-foot walls enclosing its gardens, the 7,020 pounds placed upon its marbles, and the 14,158 pounds at which it was sold, marks not only the scale of its creation, but the cost of its existence. These numbers, dry and factual, are milestones of the true price of beauty. And for those of us who tell such stories in the quiet hours, the storytellers, the midnight historians, the keepers of old ghosts, Nonsuch is a perfect subject. It begins as a fairy tale, a king's dream of splendour rising from green fields. It continues as a festival of light and water, masks and music beneath the Renaissance sky. Then, halfway through, the story changes key. The pageant gives way to records, to plague and confiscation, to inventories and account books. By its final act, the tale becomes an archaeology of fragments, a whispering of bones, plaster, and dust. When the video of this story ends, the closing voice asks the audience softly, should Nonsuch be excavated again, or should it be allowed to sleep beneath the earth? The question is less about stones than about remembrance. To dig it up might illuminate the past. To leave it buried might preserve its peace. In our own telling, we may keep that rhythm, the slow opening like dawn over Surrey, the middle alive with image and number, the ending fading into stillness, a tale that begins with the clang of hammers and ends with the brushing of dust from history's face. And so, we close with a murmur not of grandeur, but of rest. Nonsuch, the palace without equal, sleeps now beneath its meadow, its story folded into the earth. May it lie quietly beneath the grass and the stars it once tried to imitate. Good night, Nonsuch. Sleep well under your Renaissance sky. Though its body is long gone, Nonsuch has continued to live not in stone or plaster, but in the layered imagination of culture and scholarship. The palace that Henry VIII built to proclaim his supremacy has survived its own destruction by transforming into an object of study, conjecture, and dream. Every century since its disappearance has redrawn its outline, reinterpreting its meaning, and giving new voice to its silence. By the 19th century, historians, antiquarians, and early archaeologists began to turn their attention to the site. Working from fragments, they attempted to resurrect what the axe and spade had erased. They treated John Speed's map of 1611, the Hofnagel Hogenberg engraving of 1598, and the descriptive texts of Watson, Camden, and Henser as sacred documents, the golden sources from which the lost geometry of Nonsuch might be recovered. These fragile papers, etched and inked by men who had seen the palace with their own eyes, became the scaffolding for a collective act of historical imagination. Artists of the Victorian age painted romantic visions of the lost palace of the Tudors, bathed in roselight and nostalgia. Writers speculated about its rooms, its banquets, its forgotten tapestries. Meanwhile, the local parish histories of Epsom, Ewell and Cheam filled with sketches and conjectural plans, each one a little different, some drawn from scholarship, others from longing. Even the name Nonsuch began to sound less like a boast and more like a charm, a word from a half-remembered fairy tale. In the 20th century, the study of Nonsuch matured from sentiment to science. Excavations in 1959 and 1960 brought to light the material truth behind the myth, but they also gave new momentum to the public's fascination. The Ewell Museum, together with local historical societies, began to curate exhibitions under the title The Lost Palace of the Tudors. These displays combined surviving stucco fragments, models built from the 1650 survey, and digitally restored images that allowed visitors to walk, virtually, through the vanished courts. Children stared at glass cases containing bits of lead and coloured plaster, unaware that they were looking at the remains of a king's dream. Within academic circles, Nonsuch came to occupy a unique position. Scholars described it as the bridge between the medieval and the Renaissance, the architectural hinge on which English design turned from fortress to facade. Its hybrid identity, half English timber, half Italian ornament, embodied the beginnings of cultural globalization in Tudor art. The facade, modelled on Roman triumphs but executed by local craftsmen, was no longer just architecture. It was diplomacy made visible. Students of architectural history still study Nonsuch as one of the earliest English examples of royal magnificence as propaganda. The theory that monarchy could express power not merely through conquest or decree, but through style. Every feature of Nonsuch spoke a political language. The double courtyard, dividing king and queen. The stucco reliefs depicting classical virtue. The fountains representing dominion over nature. It was not merely a house to live in, but a message to Europe that England had entered the theatre of civilization. Yet outside academia, Nonsuch has taken on gentler meanings. In literature and popular imagination, the Lost Palace has become an allegory of vanity, a symbol for beauty, purchased at the cost of compassion. Writers describe it as a shimmering illusion, a monument to the futility of human pride. Its glory, they remind us, was built upon the erased village of Cuddington, upon the bones beneath the gardens, upon the silence of those whose homes became Henry's foundation stones. Nonsuch's story thus lingers as both wonder and warning, the splendour of one man's vision measured against the cost of his will. Each time archaeologists uncover another piece, a cut shard of glass, a fragment of French slate, or a stucco ram's head from the Italian workshops, it feels less like a discovery than a whisper. One can almost hear the voices of the craftsmen who once laboured there. Italians modelling mythic figures in wet plaster, Frenchmen carving marble, English carpenters fitting oak beams into Roman forms. Across the centuries their tools fall silent, yet their handiwork still breathes faintly through the soil. And perhaps, too, one hears the sigh of Henry VIII himself, the man who wanted a house that no one could equal, and who instead left behind a lesson no one could forget. His Nonsuch became not a living monument but a cautionary echo, reminding each generation that ambition, no matter how gilded, is mortal. The walls he built to challenge the kings of France now exist only in sketches and memories. The fountains that once sparkled in the sun are buried beneath the grass of Surrey. Still, in a strange way, Nonsuch has achieved the immortality Henry desired. It endures not in marble, but in metaphor. It exists in museum displays, in student theses, in novels and lectures, in the quiet devotion of those who refuse to let its name fade. The palace without equal has become the story without end. And so, as night falls over the modern park where once the courtiers rode and the deer scattered, we can almost imagine the outlines of the vanished towers against the twilight, faint, luminous, and unreal. The body of Nonsuch may be gone, but its pulse continues in ink, in memory, and in the dreams of those who still listen to history's softest voices. When one looks back at the long, fractured story of Nonsuch, it becomes clear that the palace was more than an architectural experiment. It was a mirror of Henry VIII's soul in his final years. Every stone, every gilded relief, every Italian cherub frozen in plaster reflected the paradox of a man who possessed absolute power, yet lived in profound isolation. By the time he ordered Nonsuch to rise from the quiet fields of Cuddington in the spring of 1538, Henry was no longer the vibrant Renaissance prince of his youth. He was a monarch scarred by divorces, rebellions, and the slow collapse of the body that had once embodied his might. He built Nonsuch not merely to rival the King of France, but to challenge the very memory of Rome, to proclaim that the Tudor dynasty, founded by his father after the Wars of the Roses, could surpass the glory of the Caesars. In this ambition, Henry sought permanence, as if brick and stucco could preserve the supremacy he had fought to claim through blood, politics, and faith. The palace was to stand as the material proof of his dominion, a monument not just to England's new confidence, but to his personal conviction that he, Henry VIII, was chosen to reshape the world. Yet history, with its quiet irony, wrote a different ending. Across the Channel, Fontainebleau, built by Francis I, still stands today, its courtyards echoing with the continuity of French kingship. Nonsuch, by contrast, has vanished entirely, reduced to a pattern of grass and foundation. And just as the palace disappeared, so too did the dynasty that conceived it. When Elizabeth I died in 1603, the Tudor line ended, leaving no heir. The contrast is haunting. The palace built to be without equal proved mortal like the family that dreamed it. In this sense, Nonsuch became one of England's quiet tragedies, a palace of perfection that no one could keep. Its short life, a mere 150 years, embodies the fragility of grandeur. What Henry had intended as a declaration of eternity became instead a lesson in transience. Symbolically, each wall of Nonsuch, each Greek god sculpted upon its facade, was an attempt to dress England in the robes of continental Europe. It was a bold cultural leap, a young nation on the edge of modernity, trying to speak the universal language of Renaissance humanism. Yet beneath that ambition ran something darker, a king's hunger to be more than human, to carve his name into the firmament of time. The result was both magnificent and mournful, an act of creation born from the fear of being forgotten. By the 1540s, Henry's body was failing. The once athletic figure had swollen under the weight of disease and self-indulgence. His leg ulcer, a constant agony, left him immobile for weeks. His temper, once charming, had hardened into cruelty. Wives had been lost to execution or neglect. Friends had turned to enemies. The court that had once celebrated him now moved cautiously in his shadow, whispering only what might please. In such a world, Nonsuch was not merely architecture, it was a dream of control, the illusion that a man could build something greater than his own decay. The fountains, the stuccoed gods, the vast courtyards were all gestures of defiance against the truth closing in upon him, that even kings are mortal. The glittering towers of Nonsuch were, perhaps, Henry's final act of denial, his way of telling the heavens that he would not fade quietly. And yet, when death came to him in January 1547, the palace was unfinished. He had visited it only twice, once in 1545 when his health already faltered. The work continued after his passing, but the heart that had willed it into being was gone. The dreamer had left the dream. In retrospect, Nonsuch seems less a monument to triumph than a lament in stone, the last confession of a man who could no longer control his body, his wives, or his realm. He could still command builders, sculptors, and masons. He could still summon art to mask his decline, but the silence that now surrounds the vanished palace feels like the truest echo of Henry's final years. Immense, splendid, and unbearably lonely. Perhaps that is why the story of Nonsuch still haunts us. It is not merely about a building lost to time, but about the limits of human ambition. It reminds us that even the mightiest vision, a palace, Nonsuch, in the world can dissolve like mist when the hand that shaped it turns to dust. In the end, no Nonsuch is eternal. The name itself, once a boast, has become an epitaph, a whisper for all that power cannot preserve. Beneath the fields of Surrey, under the grass and quiet sky, the stones lie dreaming. The palace Henry built to outshine the kings of France has returned to silence, as has he. And perhaps, somewhere in that silence, the echo of his dream still lingers faint, uncertain but unforgotten. If Henry VIII created Nonsuch through ambition, it was Elizabeth I who breathed life into it through art. Under her reign, the palace was transformed from a monument of pride into a stage of refinement, a living theatre where music, poetry and diplomacy danced together in the glow of torchlight. Within its courtyards, under ceilings once hammered for her father's glory, the Virgin Queen performed the art of monarchy itself, rule by spectacle, grace and intellect. In Elizabeth's time, Nonsuch became the beating heart of Tudor pageantry. Its echoing courts and scented gardens hosted elaborate masques, banquets and Renaissance dances, where courtiers in silk and velvet moved like living ornaments in her carefully orchestrated dramas of power. Trumpets sounded as the Queen entered, torches flared, and the musicians of St. Paul's School filled the air with song. For a few glittering nights, the lost palace became a world of living allegory, a mirror of her kingdom, a portrait of the monarch as muse and master. Elizabeth loved Nonsuch not only for its beauty but for what it represented. Here, in this house once built by her father's might, she could reimagine that might as elegance. The hard geometry of Henry's will softened under her touch. His marble lions and Roman gods became symbols not of conquest, but of culture. Within Nonsuch's painted chambers, the daughter of the man who broke Christendom turned politics into performance. Where her father had built with command, she ruled through imagination. The fountains, nymphs, and labyrinths that adorned the grounds became part of her symbolism. To her courtiers they were emblems of art and leisure. To poets, they were metaphors of her rule. Each curve of the maze suggested the winding paths of governance. Each fountain's stream mirrored the flow of her intellect. Each marble goddess, Venus, Diana, Astrea, echoed some facet of the Queen's myth. For Elizabeth, Nonsuch was not just a home, it was a language. In those gardens, she could embody her chosen image. Not the iron will of Henry, but the grace of Astrea, the Virgin of Justice returning to earth. When courtiers addressed her as Gloriana, they did so amid fountains and arcades that seemed born from that very name. The palace became a backdrop for the living allegory of her reign, a realm governed by intellect, chastity, and light, the feminine answer to her father's masculine monument. The chronicles of the late 16th century tell us that Elizabeth visited Nonsuch several times. In 1559, 1567, 1569, and 1580, each time bringing the full theatre of the Tudor court in her wake. The Earl of Arundel, who then owned the palace, staged magnificent entertainments in her honour. On one visit he presented her with a cabinet of silver, a gesture both of devotion and of ambition. The Queen's presence transformed Nonsuch into a shimmering stage where allegiance was performed through art. But beneath the brilliance, there was always the sense of time, passing of a flame burning at its brightest before it dims. Even as Elizabeth's court reached the height of cultural sophistication, the world beyond began to shift. The explorers sailing for new worlds, the poets aging, the Queen herself growing older. Within the marble courtyards of Nonsuch, the laughter of masks began to sound fainter, the music slower, the shadows longer. The same fountains that once reflected her youth now mirrored a face touched by time. When Elizabeth died in March 1603, the palace seemed to die with her. Her successors, James I and later Charles I, continued to use Nonsuch, but only in form, not in spirit. The soul of the place, that delicate balance of art and authority, departed with the woman who had embodied it. Under their hands, Nonsuch became property again, not poetry. From that moment, its meaning changed forever. During Elizabeth's reign, it had been a living metaphor, a Renaissance dream woven into English soil. After her death, it became a relic, its fountain silenced, its halls emptied of music. Yet even in ruin, the memory of those nights remained. The torches, the trumpets, the shimmer of silk beneath the moon. The palace had once housed ambition. Under Elizabeth, it had learned how to sing. Today, when scholars speak of the Elizabethan Golden Age, they speak also of the spirit that once animated Nonsuch. Its marble has crumbled, its gardens faded, but its legacy, that marriage of intellect and image, femininity and rule, still glows like candlelight behind the curtains of history. In the quiet hours, one might imagine the Queen walking again through those lost gardens, her gown brushing against thyme and rosemary, the air trembling with distant music. The fountains whisper, the labyrinth waits, the moonlight returns to her face. In that vision, Nonsuch still lives not as stone but as song. Nonsuch did not fall to cannon fire or collapse in a blaze of ruin. Its end came from something quieter, smaller, and far more human. The slow arithmetic of need and money. It was not destroyed by war, but by balance sheets. Not by fury, but by fatigue. The palace that had once embodied the glory of Henry VIII and the grace of Elizabeth I dissolved under the same pressures that shape all human empires: debt, neglect, and the steady erosion of meaning. After the English Civil War of the 1740s, symbols of monarchy carried a new and uneasy weight. The ornate houses of kings were no longer shrines of power, they were liabilities. When Parliament seized control, the realm was measured not in lineage but in ledgers. Everything: land, furniture, marble, even loyalty was assigned a price. Under such scrutiny, Nonsuch, distant from London and costly to maintain, was reclassified from heritage to asset, from symbol to surplus. By the middle of the 17th century, the palace that had once required over 500 craftsmen and cost more than £24,000 to build now existed as a column of figures in the state's accounting books. It was beautiful, but unprofitable. And beauty, in an age rebuilding from war, was a luxury England could no longer afford. Then came the restoration of Charles II in 1660. The monarchy returned, but the old order did not. England was changing. Wealth flowed through merchants rather than courtiers, and estates shifted hands with every royal favour or financial bargain. Nonsuch's ownership became a mirror of its century, passed from king to mistress, from duchess to creditor, from dream to transaction. When Barbara Villiers, the king's most celebrated mistress, was made Duchess of Cleveland and Baroness Nonsuch in 1670, the gift seemed like a gesture of romance. In truth, it was a payment. The palace became her collateral, a means to settle her extravagant debts. She leased it, mortgaged it, and finally, when the figures no longer balanced, ordered it taken down. There was no drama to its end, no rebellion, no fire, no lightning bolt of fate. The demolition began quietly, sometime in the 1680s, and continued piece by piece. Workers pried the lead from the roofs, carted away the marble fountains, stripped the gilded stucco from the walls. The great oak beams that had once supported the royal chambers were sold for construction in nearby towns. Each nail, each tile, each carved head of plaster found a second life elsewhere. A door frame here, a mantel there. Steel, wood, stone, lead, marble, all of it had value. The Renaissance gods who once guarded Nonsuch were reduced to commodities, sold not as art, but as materials. And in this dismantling lies a quiet truth about its age. By the end of the 17th century, art itself had become an economy. The England that had once built palaces to project divine kingship now measured worth in coin, not culture. The death of Nonsuch was not tragic in the heroic sense. There was no blaze, no elegy carved in marble. Its passing was domestic, almost polite. The sound of hammers at dawn, the creak of carts on gravel, the silence left behind when the last wall came down. Yet perhaps it is precisely this quietness that has kept it alive in memory. Had it burned, it might have been mourned and forgotten. Instead, it faded, and in fading, became a ghost. That ghost still lingers across the